Welcome to Religion 3367, Islamic Faith and Society. This is going to be a lecture devoted to the Hadith literature. That's chapter 6. This lecture is intimately related to the combined lecture which was delivered regarding chapter 4, namely the life of Muhammad, and in a way carries on and continues from that combined lecture. As I said in that previous combined lecture, and in between we had lectures on the Quran, so it's a little bit disjointed, although I did say to you in that lecture that you should jump ahead and watch this one. So whether you did that or not, anyhow, the tradition literature or the Hadith literature is intimately related to, obviously, the life of the Prophet Muhammad. But I made it clear that in the Islamic intellectual tradition, what are strictly speaking biographical works are referred to as Sīʿah, which is simply a word for biography in classical Arabic, although now it's almost exclusively as a word associated with the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. These bodies of literature in Arabic are intimately related because they concern really the same subject matter, namely the events in the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the person, as it were, of the Prophet Muhammad, especially the Hadith, his deportment, his habits, anything he may have said about almost anything under the sun, almost anything or anything and everything that he did, and things that he implicitly or tacitly approved of. And I pointed out in that combined lectures 5 and 6, the life of Muhammad parts 1 and 2, as I've called the video, I emphasized just how complex this literature is, and how authors who, even though they do have degrees in Islamic studies, such as Martin Lings, the late Martin Lings, when they write a kind of popular work for the general reading public on the life of the Prophet, as he did, he certainly did, not perhaps, oversimplified things in the sense that he never really explained his method. And because of that, you are left with this impression that this body of sources, this whole collection of data, as I called it, on the life of the Prophet ﷺ is somehow just like a homogeneous kind of continuous narrative, and it's not. There are problems, there are contradictions. So, for example, in the battles of the Prophet, there's no real sort of agreed upon, strictly speaking, chronology of the Maghazi, as they're known, and there's even a scholarly paper on that called the Chronicle of the Maghazi, excuse me, the accounts of the various battles which the Prophet Muhammad took part in. And so there are issues in the Hadith as well. And I talked about the important collections of Hadith. And today, what I'd like to do in this lecture is just look also at the kinds of complexities that we find when dealing with Hadith literature and how that impinges upon the life of the Prophet. So, I thought I had a copy of that near me, but it doesn't matter, I suppose. There's an example. So there is a famous, what's his name, modern scholar of Islamic studies named Jonathan A.C. Brown. He also happens to be a convert to Islam. And he has a degree in Islamic studies from the University of Chicago. He is a specialist on Hadith literature. And the book which I have in mind is, it's called Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction. Actually, it doesn't matter even if we're recording. I think it might be over here. Let me just go and take it. No, I'm mistaken. Unfortunately, I think I have shelved it elsewhere. My point is that in dealing with the life of the Prophet, Jonathan A.C. Brown speaks about an event in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and that is namely his marriage to somebody named Aisha. Now, Aisha is one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad was married several times in the course of his life. The first woman whom he married was known as Khadija, and while he was married to her, he did not marry any other women. In the ancient Near East, we had a polygamous society in which men often, very often, in fact, took more than one wife. It was a widespread practice in the ancient Near East. This is a whole other issue, and Islam still permits men to marry up to 4 women, although that's not really common anymore, but it's not completely a completely abandoned practice either. At any rate, while he was married to Khadija, he did not take any other wives, and his children, any and all children whom he had that survived him, were from that marriage. So Khadija died in the Meccan period. She did not live to the Hijrah, and it was later in Medina that he contracted a number of marriages, and one of these was to Aisha, who was the daughter of Abu Bakr, who was an important figure in Islamic history. Abu Bakr became the first Khalifa or Caliph of the Sunni Muslims. The Shia Muslims don't accept his caliphate. So she is his first wife, and there's a considerable amount of controversy regarding her age at the time that she was married. And so Jonathan Brown defends the idea of child marriage because the reports that you find in Sunni literature indicate that she was betrothed or promised or married in some form or fashion to the Prophet Muhammad, but that the actual, when she was 6, and that the actual wedding and consummation of that union did not take place until she was 9. Now, the problem here is, Jonathan Brown defends this. And one wonders, because you would, at least in that book, the Prophet Muhammad, a very short introduction, Oxford University Press, it's a small book. These are these little thin books. There's a whole series, like there's Islamic history, a very short introduction, Buddhism, a very short introduction, the Quran, a very short introduction. And so he's the author of Muhammad, a very short introduction. And for some reason, I can't find my copy. Maybe I lent it to someone, because I have a bunch of these and I have them all on that shelf over there, but I didn't see it anyway. So he defends this idea, but if you actually look at the sources, there are a lot of problems. Now, you have to remember that before the modern period, we have manuscript books, books that are written by hand, and mistakes can crop up and enter into manuscripts. Now, in the Arabic language, numbers before modern times were typically written out. Even in ancient times, even not really ancient, but pre-modern times, they did have a number system, which was transmitted from North Africa to Europe, and it's called the Arabic numbers. But in the eastern lands of Islam, they're written in a different way, and they come from India. And you find those in mathematical texts and so forth. But this is all much later. And in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, numbers were typically written out in words. And the word 16 and the word 19, as opposed to 6 and 9, the 6 part and the 9 part in Arabic are written separately, and the teen part, which actually means 10 in Arabic, ashar or asharah, depending on the grammatical gender of the words in question, is written separately. And so it is possible, I would argue, that there could have been some sort of a mistake or omission of that portion in some manuscripts, and this is then how we get it. But the reason that really Jonathan Brown defends this is because he is a kind of a Ḥadīth literalist, I would argue, in this regard, in as much as he has this veneration for Bukhari, the text of the collection of Bukhari, and he did his thesis at University of Chicago on the Hadith collections of Bukhari and Muslim. And because there's a Hadith in Bukhari that indicates these ages of 6 and 9, he defends it. So in Hadith sciences, you have a methodology of authentication or validation, which is based on what's called the chain of narrators. Let me explain this. In the Hadith corpus, it doesn't matter if it's Sunni Hadith or Shi'i Hadith, all the Hadith texts have a particular form. Now remember, I said a Hadith is an account, originally oral, but now written, of a statement, an action, or a tacit approval of the Prophet Muhammad. And for the Shias, they add the Imams and Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, right? So that Hadith then, that account has a chain of authorities, what's called an isnad, I-S-N-A-D, isnad. So it has a chain of authorities. So typically it'll say that Bukhari would say, well, I heard from so-and-so, who heard from so-and-so, who heard from so-and-so, who heard from, let's say, Aisha. And it should go back to a companion. Aisha would be a companion. In other words, someone who met the Prophet as a Muslim and believed in Islam and died as a Muslim. That's a companion. Or it goes back to, let's say, another famous companion, Abu Huraira, who you find in Sunni Hadith. Or let's say Ibn Mas'ud or Ibn Abbas. These are famous companion figures in the Hadith literature. And then that companion will say, I heard the Prophet say, and then there will be a quote, XYZ, or I saw the Prophet do XYZ, or such and such a thing was done in front of the Prophet, he didn't disapprove, or somebody came one day when we were all sitting around with the Prophet and asked him about this, that, and the other thing, and this is what he said, or this is what he did. So these are how hadiths are structured. In the case of Shia hadiths, it could be the Prophet, or it could go back to a companion, someone who directly knew one of the imams in question, and the rest is the same. So the methodology of authentication or validation is to look at this chain of authorities and look at all of the individuals who are in that chain and verify if they actually were contemporaries and if they actually could have met or not. And you think, well, how do you do that? Well, it turns out that a huge body of literature of biography grew up. Now, it's interesting that the genre of this kind of biography and biographical dictionary is something which, again, I think is quite unique to the Islamic tradition. And the idea of the isnad is also something quite unique to the Islamic tradition. I think you have something similar in Buddhism to some extent, but there's nobody alive today who can claim that they have an isnad going all the way back to the Buddha. This is not the case with Islam. As difficult as it may be for many people to believe or to fathom or to swallow, there are people to this day who have an isnad all the way back to, let's say, Bukhari. And then you would take Bukhari's isnad and isnad all the way back to Muslim. I have ijaza, what's called a licence, license or whatever. You study with someone, they give you ijaza so you can recite hadiths all the way back to the Prophet. And that's also not very uncommon in the Muslim world. So there are people who can do that. And then the question comes down to, well, is this hadith authentic on the basis of the evaluation of the isnad? The part that comes after the isnad, the actual text, is called the matan, M-A-T-N, matan in Arabic, which just means text. So they will validate the isnad. They'll say, oh, wait, there's this guy. This guy was known to be unreliable. So it's not just the historical dates of these people and whether they were contemporary and whether it's an established fact that they were student and disciple of each other, but also, was the person reliable in their transmission? Did the person have a good memory? And so there are, if you like, evaluations or ratings almost, if you want to say, of these hadith narrators, and there are very large books that have these compilations in them. So one of the largest collections of this nature is Tahdhib al-Kamal fi Ma'rifat al-Rijal by Al-Mizzi. This is a huge book. It's in 35 volumes. I have it down in a bookcase downstairs. I have the edition edited by Bashar Ma'ruf Awad, a famous Iraqi Salafi scholar. And there are many, and there are others. There's Mizanul I'tidal by al-Dhahabi. There's Lisanul Mizan. There's many. So I don't really want to go into all of that. There's all sorts of names of texts in Arabic. They won't really mean too much to beginners in the subject. But suffice it to say, this is how hadiths are evaluated. Now, but here's the thing. Were these hadiths all transmitted word for word? I mean, much is made of memory in the Islamic world. And indeed, especially in the case of the Quran, it's very normal for people to have the entire Quran, memorized by heart. Even young people, it's again, surprises many non-Muslims, but it's an established fact. I mean, there's even TikToks going around. And so, I mean, Muslims have known this for a long time, but, TikTok is this new medium. Some TikTok I saw recently where somebody says, even if all of the copies of the Quran were gathered together and burned and destroyed, the Quran would still remain. Again, because the Quran is an oral text. And in the first instance, it is recited. Quran, again, as I've said before many times, means the glorious recitation. Al-Quran. Al-Quranul Majid, the glorious recitation. So much is made of memory, but does that really extend to everything? I mean, the Quran is recited constantly. The Hadith is not. The Hadith is huge. Again, we basically have only talked very briefly about, these 6 major books among the Sunnis: Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, An-Nasa'i. There's others. There's Ad-Darimi. They usually go by the names of the compilers. There's many others. Then there's all the Shīʿah collections like Al-Kafi, Man La Yahduru Al-Faqih, At-Tahdhib, Al-Istibsar. These are all, Arabic titles. But there's others as well. There's Bihar al-Anwar, another Shiite collection. There's Kanzul Ummal, a huge Sunni collection. And a lot of the later collections are basically amalgamations of the earliest collections, just reorganized by chapter and indexed in certain ways and so forth. So this is an ongoing tradition that Muslims have been involved in for centuries. But the hadith are not constantly recited. And there is even a discussion among hadith scholars within their tradition about whether hadiths were always just, transmitted word for word. When someone says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said XYZ, do we really take that to be a verbatim transmission? Or were there instances of a naql bil ma'na, or what's called paraphrase? In other words, the person putting it back into their own words. And this certainly took place because when in hadiths you have what's called corroboration. You have the same hadith, in other words, the same statement transmitted, or the same account of an event or a tacit approval transmitted through different people, through different chains. And you find that they often do not match up word for word. So there are instances of this. So is everything really so straightforward? And so Jonathan Brown defends this idea, coming back to the Aisha example, because he accepts Bukhari. He has this view that Bukhari is absolutely solid. And a view emerged, not immediately, but over time, among the Sunni Muslim community, that the collection of Bukhari was decisive. And in fact, that the collection of Bukhari is the most correct book after the Quran. So the Quran, by all Muslims, Sunni, Shi'i, Mu'tazili, Salafi, whatever, have all regarded always the Quran as being utterly beyond reproach, utterly authentic in all its different recitations, modes of recitation. And really the only difference of opinion is on the interpretation and meaning, but there's no difference of opinion on the text. What constitutes the recited Quran? No difference there. So then the question boils down to, the hadith. And as I was saying, so this view emerged. And in the beginning, when Bukhari's text started being, circulated, actually didn't have the same prestige, let's say, in the Western lands of Islam, in North Africa and Spain. People regarded the collection of Muslim to be better. In fact, it is superior in the sense that it has a much better scheme of organization and chapterization. Bukhari's chapterization is not very good. meaning sometimes the chapter headings really don't reflect what's in the chapter. Was this the fault of Bukhari, or is this the fault of the manuscripts and the way that it was transmitted? Or were the materials of Bukhari not really in a polished form and they were put together by his students? These are all arguments that have been made, but this is the situation that we have. So if you actually look at some extraneous facts outside of this hadith in Bukhari that Jonathan Brown, feels that he has to defend, you will see that we don't really know, decisively when, let's say, Aisha was born. It's usually death dates are more well attested in the Islamic tradition because, people become famous and then their death is made note of because there will be a funeral, people will attend the funeral, there will be a funeral prayer, and then these biographers, and there were many of them, would compile these dates in their biography. So we know when Aisha died. We know how old she was when she died, and we know that she had one of her sisters is Asma bint Abi Bakr, Asma son of Abu Bakr. She was from a different mother, but she's his sister, and that still their sisters. And we know when she died as well, and how old she was when she died, and we know the age difference between them. And if you tally that all up, then it turns out that there's no way that Aisha could have been married at 6 or 9. And that, in fact, she would probably have been much near around 18, 19, maybe 20, 21 years old, depending on how you actually refine the mathematics of it. And I find it really interesting that, Jonathan Brown doesn't, at least in that text, maybe he has elsewhere, to be fair to the man, I don't have an axe to grind. I'm just saying he may have addressed it somewhere. I haven't searched and read every single thing he's written. Maybe he's made a statement on YouTube. Please be happy to point that out. If he has, email me, put in the comments. But that alone sort of calls into question the presumed almost sort of infallibility with which this method of hadith validation and authentication has been vested. That, if you just check the isnad, that's enough. Well, it's not. I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't matter if something is widely attested. If they're transmitting an error, it's an error. I said this to my students that, let's say I have 20 students in a class, and I could say that, well, I could tell you something today which is absolutely false. Just to make an example. Let's say I tell you that that water boils at 300 degrees Celsius. Okay, just to make an example. And everybody hears this and writes this down, and then they teach this to their students, and they do this for 100 years, and you have a perfect isnad. Water still doesn't boil at 300 degrees Celsius. By convention, it's defined, the system of international units, sent to Celsius scale, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. So even if you have a perfect isnad, you can transmit something which isn't true. Errors can also come in. People can misquote. And as we saw in the case of the tale of the high-flying cranes, and there are others, like the Ashura fast, I think things can be cooked up, and they have been in Islamic history because there have been competing interests, competing theological and political interests, and they had no scruples about concocting hadith. Many people find this hard to believe, especially Muslims, but Muslim hadith scholars themselves have recognized that hadiths were fabricated. There are entire books devoted to hadith fabrication and hadith fabricators. So that's something within the Islamic tradition that people know about. So there can also be simple cases where people make a mistake. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So I'm not just talking in theoretical terms. I try and back up what I say with actual sources. So here is volume 1 of 9, and there's 2 in each volume. And then one of the volumes has 3. This is the first volume of Bukhari. This is a reprint of the edition that came out in the last days of the Ottoman Empire under the rule of Sultan Abdul Hamid Khan. And it's really beautiful, sort of facsimile edition. It was published in Cairo at the Bulaq Press in the year 1311 of the Hijrah. It's 1444 right now. And I'm going to refer you to the very, very first hadith. This is a famous hadith. So Bukhari's book opens with presumably a chapter title, but the word chapter isn't there, called كيف كان بدء الوحي إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم. That's the beginning of the so-called, chapter or section heading. And that means how the revelation began to come to the messenger of Allah, peace be upon him. It says there, sallallahu alayhi wasallam in the Arabic here. Okay, but there is no hadith after that that talks about how revelation began. The whole story of going to the cave of Hira and all that isn't there. That's in the second hadith transmitted from Aisha. The first hadith has nothing to do with that. So in the first hadith, and I'll read the isnad to give you the flavor here. So Bukhari says, Haddathana. Haddathana means the hadith was related to us. He's using the royal we. Who related the hadith to Bukhari? Al-Humaydi. A guy named Al-Humaydi. Abdullah ibn Zubayr. That's his name. Al-Humaydi, Abdullah ibn Zubayr. Qala haddathana. He said, haddathana Sufyan. Sufyan told us. Qala, then he said, haddathana Yahya. Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari told us. Qala, he said, akhbarani Muhammad ibn Ibrahim at-Tamimi. So this guy, Muhammad ibn Ibrahim at-Tamimi, conveyed to me, annahu, that he heard, annahu sami'a Alqama ibn Waqqas al-Laythi. That's the name, that he heard Alqama ibn Waqqas al-Laythi say, sami'atu Umar ibn al-Khattab. So finally we get to someone who knew a companion, and that's this chap by the name of Alqama ibn Waqqas al-Laythi, who said that I heard Umar ibn al-Khattab. I heard Umar, very famous companion. He becomes the second caliph after Abu Bakr of the Sunni Muslims. Umar ibn al-Khattab, radiyallahu anhu, says here, may Allah be pleased with him, ala al-minbar, on the pulpit in the mosque, qala, who said, sami'tu Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I heard the messenger of Allah, upon whom be peace, yaqulu, saying, innamal a'malu bin niyat. Now the hadith begins. All of that was isnad, this is matan. So what was the statement that the Prophet said according to this account? Innamal a'malu bin niyat. Verily, acts are by intentions. In other words, actions are judged by intentions. Wa innama likulli imri'in ma nawa. And each person gets, or is rewarded, or and each person, is given his due, as it were, according to his intention. فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى دُنْيَا يُصِيبُهَا أَوْ إِلَى امْرَأَةٍ يَنْكَحُهَا فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى مَا هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِ. So the next part says that, so whomsoever's migration from one place to another in this world was for worldly ends that he might attain, or to marry a particular woman, for example, so shall be that person's hijrah, or that person's migration, in terms of that which he migrated toward or for. So in other words, it's a hadith that's simply saying is that human beings' actions should be judged according to intentions. And if someone does something in this world for some worldly gain, then that is what they will get. And he gives the example that, he travels for some worldly gain or to marry a particular woman, then the reward of that person will be in accord for the reason or the intention behind which that person migrated. All right, so that's the hadith. Now, Bukhari very clearly at the very beginning says that he is transmitting this from Al-Humaydi, and that he heard this from Al-Humaydi. So Bukhari's teacher was a guy named Al-Humaydi. We have Al-Humaydi here. Al-Humaydi died in the year 219 of the Hijrah, and he had a collection of hadith called Al-Musnad, and here it is. It's in 2 volumes. This is volume 1, and this is the edition published by Darul Kutub al-Ilmiya in Beirut. This is the first printing, 1409 of the Hijrah, or 1988. If you turn to page 16 and 17 of volume 1, you find this hadith. And you don't find it with the exact wording that's there in Bukhari. So you have Al-Humaydi, Sufyan, Sayyid Ibrahim, Tamimi, Al-Qama. So the isnad is the same, Umar al-Khattab, but the wording is different. Here he says, we're just starting with what Omar said, that the Prophet said, and now we're on page 17. That all that isnad was on page 16. At the top, page 17 says, "Innamal a'malu binniyat." So again, that's the same. That indeed actions are judged according to intentions. وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ إِمْرِئٍ مَّا نَوَى. And each person is, gets what they get or is given their due according to their intention. Then it says, فَمَنْ كَانَتْ هِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ فَهِجْرَتُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. This entire phrase is not there in Bukhari. In other words, it says here, whomsoever's migration was to Allah and his messenger, thus shall his migration be toward Allah and his messenger. And then it says, and whomsoever's migration was for some worldly end, or to marry a particular woman, then so shall his migration be to that for which he migrated. So that business there in between is not there. Isnad is the same. It's Bukhari's teacher. It's here in Humaydi. What do you think happened? The phrases are very similar in Arabic. It's very possible that when he was writing this down, he or some manuscript copier who came later didn't see that, because the phrase that's dropped is very close in wording to the phrase that comes after it. And you can see how you're writing this down and you look down over here and then you look over it and you miss that. So, and this isn't something I've made up, I've shown it to you. So this example alone shows you that, Bukhari is not some infallible book, and that, the views of people like Jonathan Brown are misplaced. So that's an example. If you're more interested in learning about Hadith and Hadith literature, this is an excellent and very accessible, readable book. It's called Hadith Literature. Its Origin, Development, and Special Features by Muhammad Zubayr Siddiqui. It's published by the Islamic Text Society, Cambridge, UK, 1993. Because it's a UK publication, it might be a little expensive. I know that there are other editions of this published in India and Pakistan, which are cheaper, and maybe you can find them, and maybe you can even find a PDF online. But this is a very good book. It has the names of all of the key Hadith scholars in the Sunni tradition and their books, and brief little descriptions of them. If you read this, you'll have a really good grasp of the subject. It doesn't deal with the Shīʿah Hadith. There is no such book in the English language. I have written a short paper on that, which lists the fundamental Shīʿah Hadith texts. That was published in an Italian journal back in the year 2000 called Oriente Moderno. The article is in English. If you want it, go to my academia.edu page, search under my name, and you will find it there. You can download the PDF for free. So, not to pick on Jonathan Brown, but he is considered the go-to guy for Hadith. He's the author of this book, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World. I think this is a much better book by someone who really knew the subject. And I don't really think too highly of this book, and I'm just going to use it as a point of departure for some other examples of Hadith to discuss in this lecture. So if you give me a moment. So Hadiths, they're very, very prominent in any discussion on almost any topic in Islam. And excuse me, one of the controversies in the Muslim world has to do with Sufism. This sort of, for want of a better term, mystical dimension of Islam. And people who are Sufis, they tend to practice some additional supererogatory, obligations in addition to the 5 daily prayers, fasting in Ramadan, and so forth, having to do with the invocation of the divine name and things of this kind, additional prayers in the middle of the night, things along those lines. So there are certain hadiths here which he quotes in connection with Sufism. So I refer you to page 192 of this book, Ḥadīth, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World by Jonathan A.C. Brown. This is One World Publications, 2009. What is One World? One World is a British publisher in Bloomsbury, which is an area in London. So if you refer to page 192, he says, since the early period of Sufism, mystics have understood the absolute contrast between the ultimate reality of God and the transience of his creation. As the Quran states, all things perish except his face. The Arabic is كل شيء حالك إلا وجهه. Many Sufis stressed how all of creation is nothing more than an ephemeral reflection of God's magnificence, and held that man's greatest accomplishment is to penetrate the veil of this world and become annihilated in God in this life, as one forged hadith puts it. He says here, as a forged hadith. The forged hadith, according to him, between quotes, is die before you die. Mutu qabl an tamutu. So, he doesn't give any evidence for why this hadith should be forged. What are the different sources it's quoted in? And in fact, he gives a footnote, that's footnote 28. He footnotes a book in English written by the Iranian Shiite Sufi, modern day contemporary Sufi teacher Javad Nurbakhsh, entitled Traditions of the Prophet, page 66. So he obviously doesn't like this hadith. Another hadith, for example, that he doesn't like is, here it is on page 194, a second hadith that served as an important piece of evidence in Ibn Arabi's Theosophical Sufism. Ibn Arabi is an important figure in the history of Sufism. He died in the year 638 of the Hijrah. He was from Spain. He died and was in the eastern lands of Islam, is buried in Damascus. And he has a very respected position among Sufis, and the kind of Sufism that he's practiced or is associated with is termed by Jonathan Brown to be Theosophical Sufism. It's got a very sort of philosophical discussion of things, although he wasn't a philosopher and didn't write in philosophical language. People who came after him, who were his disciples, did use language of this kind. And so there's a famous hadith called the Hadith of Reason. And it's also a what's called a Hadith Qudsi. So I should say a word or two about that. A Hadith Qudsi, or a sacred hadith, is a hadith in which you have the isnad and it goes back to the Prophet, but then the Prophet says that God says. And so God says, and then in that hadith, God will speak in the first person. I'd say this, or I say that. And even though it's supposed to be the speech of God, it is not part of the Quran. So there is a Hadith Qudsi of this kind. And again, he doesn't give a source here. On page 194, he just puts it in bold. He says, indeed, God, when he created reason, he said to it, come, and it came. Then he said, go back, and it went back. So God said, by my glory and beauty, I have not created anything nobler than you. By you I will take, and by you I will give. The Arabic, and again, is baffling. He doesn't have a source here. There's no footnote. But the Arabic, he says, he writes it out in English letters, إن الله لما خلق العقل قال له أقبل فأقبله ثم قال أدبر فأدبره فقال وعزتي وجمالي, it has here. ما خلقت خلقا أشرف منك فبك آخذ وبك أعطي. After that, Jonathan Brown says, this hadith established an important tenet of Sufism and speculative theology in Islam in general. Man's reason is ultimately subordinate to God and serves the cause of grasping his truth. For Ibn Arabi and upholders of the theosophical Sufi tradition, there were three ways for humans to gain knowledge. And he goes on and on. Then in the next paragraph, he says, unfortunately, neither the hadith, and there's another hadith he doesn't like, so we'll just, and I haven't just mentioned it, so we'll just leave that. Unfortunately, neither the hadith, which we didn't mention, nor the hadith of reason, as he calls it, had any basis in the actual words of the Prophet, according to Muslim scholars. Again, no sources given. So it's clear that Jonathan Brown is committed to a particular sort of Sunni understanding of things, and that to a kind of Salafi understanding of things. We will look at Salafism later, a kind of literalist understanding of Islam, which you find, which is also known as Wahhabism, which you find in Saudi Arabia, and you also find among the Muslim Brotherhood. And Jonathan Brown has known Muslim Brotherhood connections. What he doesn't tell you is that you do actually find this hadith. You do find it in Sunni collections, and they may not be respected, but for example, there is a Kitab al-Aql by Ibn Abi Dunya and other Sunni sources, but the preeminent place where you find it is in the Shīʿah collections. This is the collection known as Al-Kafi. Al-Kafi is here, it's 8 volumes. This is volume 1. And you will find this hadith at the very, very beginning of volume 1. But it's a Shīʿah hadith. So, you know, if you reject the Shīʿah tradition, then I suppose it's out. And you'll find many versions of this. So here's one version. This is just to give you an example and a taste and a flavor of what Shīʿah hadiths are like. So he says here, Akhbarana. So this is Muhammad. This is Ja'far ibn Abu Ja'far, Muhammad ibn Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kulayni, just al-Kulayni for short, who died in 329 of the Hijrah. It's now 1444. He says, Akhbarana. So I was informed by, or we were informed by Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Yaqub. This is actually al-Kulayni, this is the other person here. This is actually al-Kulayni, and this Akhbarana then would refer to the person writing this manuscript. And then he says, Qala haddathani uddatun min ashabina minhum. So he says that a number of our companions, or he really means scholars or transmitters of hadith, have related to us, one of them being Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Attar, who transmits from Ahmad ibn Muhammad, who transmits from Ahmad ibn Muhammad, who transmits from al-Qasim ibn Mahbub, who transmits from al-Ala ibn Razin, on the authority of Muhammad ibn Muslim, on the authority of Abu Ja'far. That would be Muhammad al-Baqir, the 5th Imam, alayhi salam, who said, لَمَّا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْعَقْلَ اسْتَنْطَقَهُ. When God created intellect, is how it would translate. There he translated reason, but the word is aql. When God created intellect, or the intellect or the intelligence, استنطقه ثم قال له, he caused it to speak, and then he gave it the power of speech, and then he said to it, he commanded it, aqbil, advance, not come, but advance, فأقبل, and it advanced. ثم قال له, then he said to it or commanded it, adbir, retreat, فأدبر, and it retreated, went backwards, in other words. ثم قال, then he said, وعزتي وجلالي, I swear by my might and my majesty, ما خلقت خلقا هو أحب إلي منك. I have not created anything in the creation more beloved to me than you. ولا أكملتك إلا في من أحب. And then it goes on, and this isn't there. It says, and I don't cause you to become completed or perfected إلا في من أحب, except in a person whom I truly love. أما إني إياك آمر, as for myself, it is by virtue of you that I command people, وإياك أنهى, and forbid people, وإياك أعاقب وإياك أثيب, and because of you, or on by virtue of you that I punish people and I reward them. In other words, what is being said is that reason or intelligence is the faculty which is within human beings, and by virtue of them having some sort of intelligence and being able to distinguish between right and wrong, which has been established by the teachings of the Prophet and revelation and so on and so forth, it is by virtue of that discernment that they have that God commands them and forbids them and rewards them and punishes them. But again, Brown gives no reference to this, even though in this book he tries to include Shīʿah hadith as well, but he just rejects it there. So this is a pretty shallow work in this regard. So you see that in the area of hadith, again, things are complicated. You have to be careful. People have their commitments, they have their agendas. And this is the situation which we have here. I will conclude with an example, another example. Sorry, there's another hadith which you find very important in Sufism. And that hadith is sometimes referred to as Hadith al-Nur, or the Hadith of Light. So there is a belief among Muslims who follow the Sufi tradition as well as the Shia tradition. There's a lot of overlap and commonality in many areas. There's also differences between the Sunni Sufism as a Sunni phenomenon and Shia Islam. And one of these is the doctrine that the first thing to be created was the light of the Prophet Muhammad, or the luminous reality of the Prophet Muhammad. So the light is called An-Nur al-Muhammadi, the Muhammadan light, or it's referred to as the luminous reality, or is merely the real, or simply the reality of Muhammad, or what's called al-Haqiqat al-Muhammadiyya. And there's actually more than one hadith in this regard, but there's a famous one which is considered by probably the majority of strict hadith scholars as being fabricated, and that is the hadith ascribed to Jabir, excuse me, to Jabir, and he's a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, and yeah, so he asks the Prophet, what's the first thing to be created, and then the Prophet Muhammad says to him, أول شيء خلق نور نبيك يا جابر. This is Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. Jabir ibn Abdullah. Jabir, son of Abdullah. And it says the first thing to be created was the light of your prophet, O Jabir. Now you find this widely quoted in Sunni literature, Sufi literature. But if you actually go and try to find a hadith, you will have trouble finding it. And if you actually look into this matter, you will find that in some Sufi texts, they'll say that this hadith is in a book called the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani. Okay, just stick with me here. So Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani, he was a Yemeni scholar. And the last portion of his name, as-San'ani, indicates that he was from Sana'a in the Yemen. And he was one of the teachers of Bukhari and Muslim. So he had a huge collection of hadith called the Kitab al-Musannaf. And if you actually go and check this, and the first, maybe there's a newer edition, but the first critical edition of this work was published by Habibur Rahman al-A'zami in 12 volumes. And I have this book. And if you search through the 12 volumes of this book, you won't find this hadith. So does that mean that this hadith didn't exist? Where did these other guys get it? Of course, then the claim is made that they just cooked it up. Well, the problem is, if you actually look into this, that Habib al-Rahman al-A'zami, who was a 20th century scholar of hadith from India, The fact is that for centuries, the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani wasn't available. You have to remember that we only have these sort of published books in modern times. Before, books were written by hand. And the Musannaf is a large book, and it wasn't easy to copy these out. And so there weren't necessarily lots and lots of copies of especially very big books in personal libraries. They may have been in private libraries. They may have been accessible in that way. And so it turns out that in terms of ancient written copies, there's only one in the world. And that is in the Murad Mullah collection, which is in Istanbul. Murad Mullah is the name of a person. It was the name of a library in Istanbul. All of the sort of ancient, libraries from the Ottoman Empire that were in what is today modern Turkey have all been consolidated into two places. The Süleymaniye Library in Istanbul, in the Süleymaniye area, which is near the Süleymaniye Mosque. I have been there to the library and the mosque. And then there is another one called Bayezid, which is near the Bayezid Mosque. And yes, I've been there too. I've worked in both of these libraries. And so the only copy that remains is in the Murad Mullah collection there in Istanbul in the Süleymaniye Library. So Habibur Rahman al-Azami went there and, he transcribed the whole thing and they typeset it and it was published. This was before digital publishing. All this is before computers as we have them today. And in the introduction, he says that this manuscript is in bad shape and that there are lots of portions and pages missing. Aha. So that supports the idea that this hadith could have been in there. And to make a long story short, hadiths of this kind are quoted in other Sunni works. And I could go into a great deal of detail on this if I wanted to, but I won't. I will just give you another example. There is a book entitled the Kitab al-Tara'if, which was written by a scholar in the Abbasid period who died at the end of the Abbasid period in the 7th century of the Hijrah. So about more than 750 years ago, this guy died. And this book, Kitab al-Tara'if, is a polemical work. It's a book of debate between Sunni and Shia doctrines. And in this, he quotes from a Sunni source. And that Sunni source is Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Ahmad ibn Hanbal is an important early Sunni scholar. He's a founder of one of these four famous Sunni schools of law, the four most famous Sunni schools of law. His is the fourth. And he's also the compiler of a huge book of hadith called the Kitab al-Musnad, known as the Musnad of Ahmad or the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Okay. So the author of the Kitab al-Tara'if, whose name is Ibn Tawus, he quotes Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and he says there's a hadith in Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and he actually says it's in the Musnad, and that this hadith is transmitted from the companion Salman al-Farisi. And that Salman al-Farisi said, Sami'atu Habibi Rasulullah. I heard my beloved, the Messenger of Allah, say, قال خلقت أنا وعلي من نور واحدة. In which the Prophet says that me and Ali, or Ali and I, and Ali is the first Imam of the Shiites. He's the fourth Sunni Caliph. He's the cousin of the Prophet. He's also the man who married the Prophet's daughter, Fatima. So he says that Ali and I were created from the same light. So again, there's this idea of light, but again, Ali comes into it as well. And people like Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, this Andalusian or Spanish Sufi who was born in Spain, lived in the eastern lands of Islam, died, is buried in Syria, who Jonathan Brown also, didn't like and mentioned in that passage about so-called Theosophical Sufism. He also quotes this in one of his works. So then you have to wonder, and I came across this hadith many years ago, and I was really baffled by it. And I had many manuscripts, old manuscripts of this work. I even eventually found a manuscript that was written within about 30 years of the death of Ibn Tawus in the Abbas, at the end of the Abbasid period, which is held in the National Library of Iran. It's like the Library of Congress here. There's National Library there. And so the hadith is there. So where did this come from? You know, and Ibn Tawus, the guy who wrote this book, he was a huge bibliophile. He had a huge library. There's even an entire book in English about the library of Ibn Tawus by a guy named Itan Kohlberg. It's called Ibn Tawus and his library. It's called A Medieval Muslim Scholar at Work, Ibn Tawus and his library. It's a very expensive book, published by E. J. Leiden. So it stands to reason that Ibn Tawus was a great, you know, bibliophile, and that he had this book. And in fact, we know that he had this book because he wrote a catalog of his library, and the catalog survives even though some of the books in his library are gone. So we know that he had Ahmad ibn Hanbal. If you go to the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal today, you don't find this hadith there. And so again, you have to scratch your head. Well, was it edited out? Were the manuscripts defective or what? But Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a prolific guy. That's not the only book he ever wrote. He wrote another book called the Fada'il al-Sahaba, or the merits or the virtues of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. And so I checked there. And if you go there, the bulk of the book is devoted to Ali ibn Abi Talib. And if you go to the Ali ibn Abi Talib section, and I want to say that this book is in 2 volumes. Both volumes were published in Riyadh, the capital of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is the center of Salafi, Wahhabi, anti-Sufi, anti-Shia, you know, understanding of Islam in the world today. The book was published there. You go to volume 2, and indeed you find this very hadith in that text of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, word for word. So maybe Ibn Tawus made a mistake, or there's a mistake in the manuscript, and what he actually was quoting about from Ahmad ibn Hanbal was from this other book, but it is in Ahmad ibn Hanbal. It may also have been in the Musnad, and, you know, for whatever reason, it's not in the copies that we have today. So this is another example. And I remember I met a very famous hadith scholar. I went to see him in 20, when was that? 2011 or 2012. 2012 in Jordan, in Amman. And his name is Sheikh Hassan Saqaf. He's Saqaf is the last name, but a lot of people in Arabic dialect, they say Sagaf, Hassan Sagaf. And I went to visit him with a friend, and we sat in he had like an open majlis, or an open gathering where you could go, and it was like a class, and he was teaching his class. And, you know, if you were a visitor, you would just sit and sort of audit the class and wait till it was over. And then we had tea and etc. And then got to know the guy, and, you know, introduced myself and so forth. And he was very, very gracious man. He is a Sayyad. He's a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad as well. And he gave me some of his books as a gift. And, you know, we exchanged things, and then we agreed to meet at another time. And I went back and I looked at some of these books, and he actually had a whole essay in one of his books talking about how this hadith of light, the Jabr hadith, had no basis. And so I thought, wow. So then I sat down, opened my laptop, and I wrote a rebuttal to that in Arabic, typed up the whole thing, printed it out, signed it, and then I was going to go have dinner with him the next day. Then I went and I handed it to him. And I said, I think you need to read this. And then we had an interesting discussion. So even accomplished scholars of hadith, and Hassan Sagaf is not a Salafi. In fact, he's kind of a Sufi-minded person. Even he had, you know, a kind of question mark about this hadith. So all of this to make the point that hadith is extremely important, that it's a lot more complicated than what Daniel Brown makes it out to be. Hadith is central in all discussions of Islamic theology and law and ritual, and it's very much a part of the lives of Muslims today. It's typical when Muslims gather that they'll recite a hadith from the Prophet, or they'll work it into their speech, and people are constantly quoting hadith almost as much as they quote the Quran among Muslims. So it's very important for you to understand this, but it's also very important to understand just how complicated this body of hadith literature is, and that even, you know, experts can make mistakes in this, and can often change their mind. And in fact, so the interpretation and authentication of hadith is not a done deal. Although many people will lead you to think that, even among Muslims. But people who really go into hadith sciences really understand and appreciate how complex it is. And it's simply my goal to give you some sort of a glimpse into that world in the form of this lecture. I hope you found it useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.